Welcome back to Dentro la Storia, the channel for those who love contemporary history. Today we're talking about one of the most controversial topics in the contemporary history of our Italy, an event that marked the very first days of our republic. The republic, as you know, was born thanks to the referendum of June 2nd and 3rd, 1946. Well, not even 3 weeks go by and he is dismissed. A document, an amnesty, accompanied by a pardon that covers many crimes and allows what at the time was called pacification. But for many people, and also for some historians and some political scientists, it was perhaps the worst of mistakes. The Togliatti Amnesty, this is our topic today, is one of the most debated episodes in the political and legal history of post-war Italy. The amnesty and pardon measure of June 22, 1945, signed by Palmiro Togliatti in his role as Minister of Justice. It was presented as a necessary tool to bring peace to a country devastated by the Second World War. It sparked debate. This measure was accused of having favored the impunity of the guilty instead of truly healing the fractures and mending the wounds. Today we will talk exactly about this, about the Togliatti Amnesty, what it was, what it produced, and what effects it had. When the so-called Togliatti Amnesty was promulgated on June 22, 1946, Italy was a country, as we said, still in ruins, destroyed, and in need of reconstruction. But not only through material reconstruction. The ruins I'm talking about are not just the destroyed buildings, the devastated streets, the infrastructure that needs to be completely rebuilt or reinforced. There's much more. There's a society that is torn apart. The almost 2 years of the War of Liberation, basically from September 8, 1943 to April 25, 1945, but if we want, maybe even a bit more. Before that, going back to July 25, 1943, they left behind a feeling of suspicion and also the desire for mutual revenge. When the war ends, when the Nazi-fascist forces surrender, when the armistices are signed, not everything is over. There are those who want to take justice into their own hands to settle the wrongs that have been done for too long. And in the case of fascism, we're talking about wrongs that go back to the 1920s. The entire 20-year period, the whole dictatorship, and of course the most violent part, that of the RSI, the Italian Social Republic. We already talked about this in the videos from 2 months ago. You can find them on the channel. To prevent other petty acts of revenge, some of which had already been recorded from happening. The Ministry of Justice, represented by the Minister of Justice, who at the time is the leader of the PCI, Palmiro Togliatti, decides to take a special measure, the amnesty, accompanied by the pardon. To draw a line, as one might say figuratively, to turn the page, to give Italian society, torn apart by a very harsh conflict, the chance to start over. In this regard, the amnesty, which was initially supposed to concern only the fascists and the accomplices of fascism, also benefits the partisans who committed crimes after the liberation and up until July 31, 1945. The idea of Palmiro Togliatti, who led the PCI during the Salerno turn, we have already talked about this as well, who led the PCI in defining the campaign for the Republic, and who is participating with his men and women in drafting the new constitution. The idea is precisely to start from scratch. His amnesty provides for the commutation of the death penalty, which is still in force at that time, to life imprisonment. Life sentences, clearly not those already converted to the death penalty, are converted to 30 years in prison. Sentences up to 5 years are canceled. Those that are higher, so intermediate between over 5 years and up to 30 years, are reduced by 1/3. And in the case of crimes not yet judged, but with proceedings still in the investigative phase, the amnesty interrupts the work of the judiciary, a whitewash, a real whitewash that basically serves to give many Italians a second chance. The first reaction is a wave of releases from prison. The prisons empty out. However, the application to a large number of cases, both in the investigative phase and already judged, immediately provokes protests. Just think that only a week after the promulgation, It is Togliatti himself who is forced to issue a brief interpretative circular, appealing against overly broad interpretations of the decree. And he recalls the categories of people who must essentially be subject to all this. But that's not enough. A second circular is needed. This one, dated July 10, 1946, explicitly recommends the application of the amnesty. Even partisans who had committed crimes in the 3 months immediately after the liberation were included, the so-called revenge crimes. During that period, one of the first crises also occurred. De Gasperi resigned on July 1, 1946, and a few days later he formed his second government, in which Togliatti no longer appears. The role of Minister of Justice passes to Fausto Gullo, another member of the Communist Party who had previously been Minister of Agriculture. Regardless, what becomes known and will go down in history as the Togliatti Amnesty benefits over 200,000 people, exactly 219,481. Most of these people had basically committed minor offenses. There were those who had been investigated for black market activities, some for receiving stolen goods, others for minor acts of violence, like slapping a boy or punching a former official. But among the beneficiaries, there were also those who had held top leadership positions. Think of the prefects and police chiefs who had remained under the Italian Social Republic, enforcing Mussolini's directives and collaborating with the Germans, or those who had committed murders, rapes, and acts of torture. But there were also those who had appealed to the Supreme Court for sentences longer than 5 years and were now amnestied. Let's not even talk about that. There were shocking cases, people who had participated in the Italian Social Republic in the Republican forces and were released from prison anyway. After the amnesty, just over 2,000 fascists remained in prison, about 1,800 already convicted and others awaiting trial. What should basically be, as was said before, a cleansing, the chance to start over from scratch, actually leads to constant criticism. Criticism comes from different sides. Criticism also comes from the Communist Party itself, which does not appreciate what has been done. And so one of the first legends linked to the Togliatti Amnesty is born. That is, that it was drafted by technicians from the Ministry of Justice and submitted to Togliatti for his signature, almost without his knowledge, or by informing him of only part of the content, basically telling him that the amnesty was meant to cover everything. The crimes of everyone, including the partisans who had gone too far with their revenge, and nothing more. Togliatti would have basically trusted them and been deceived. This legend circulates especially among the partisan circles who protest. They protest a lot. Just think that not even a month and a half after the promulgation of the Togliatti Amnesty, the Public Security Corps, that is, the police, reports that over 1,300 partisans have decided to go back into hiding, to make themselves untraceable, not to return their weapons, to remain underground. All this causes complaints. In Casale Monferrato, for example, the population chooses a general strike in protest, demanding a review of the death sentence against 6 fascists, including the local secretary of the Republican Fascist Party, Giuseppe Sardi. Police and Carabinieri have to intervene in several places in Italy because of the riots, or to try to mediate with reasonable people who are trying to calm things down. The Togliatti Amnesty also gives rise to a violent faction, the one that will be called the Red Patrol, a squad of former partisans who turn into vigilantes, determined to take justice into their own hands, with the intention of pursuing the fascists released from prison following the amnesty, considering the amnesty itself useless and counterproductive. There are cases of lynchings, of beatings. In short, reconciliation is hard to see. It struggles to have any real effects. Among other things, it's not the only amnesty of the period. Looking at the timeline, you realize that already on the following September 6, 1946, the legislative decree of the Provisional Head of State, Enrico de Nicola, number 96, as a law, as a decree, extends the maximum terms of the amnesty to July 31, 1945. 1990, a year and a half later, it's February 7. 1948, the new government launches. A decree submitted, proposed by the Undersecretary to the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, Giulio Andreotti. Yes, that Andreotti, with whom the still pending judgments after the 1946 amnesty are extinguished. So it's a further extension for some measures. Let's move forward 5.5 years. Let's go to September 18th, 1953. And the Pella government approves a pardon and amnesty for all political crimes committed up to June 18th, 1948. So it basically extends even further the effects of the Togliatti Amnesty. But what does all this mean? If in Germany, starting from 1945 and for about 10 years, there was a process of complete denazification, which was carried out by the Allied authorities, and it involved almost the entire German population. But in Italy, none of this happened. It's not just a matter of purging and sentencing the old leaders to prison, or in the case of Nuremberg, to death. It's about eradicating from a nation and its people those sick ideas that led that nation and those people to follow the man who shouts the loudest, the dictator, all the way into the abyss. In Germany, denazification concerns everyone and includes a classification of Nazi risk. It includes the possibility of intervening through what we would now call re-education. By assessing each individual citizen's profile, their level of involvement with Nazism and with Nazi organizations, up to a final judgment of successful social rehabilitation. In Italy, none of this happens, not only because there are no Nuremberg-style trials, but practically none of the leaders who survived the war end up in the dock, and if they do, the trial ends with a conviction. It's not just that. There's also the fact that everyone who had contact with fascism, from those who did so for work reasons to those who were involved for political reasons, finds a place in society again. So you might wonder why. Let's start with the nerve centers of the state, a state that needed to be rebuilt, but which was partly based on political and social infrastructures that already existed. It couldn't do without ministerial staff, ministerial directors, and other figures who had worked under fascism and with fascism. Simply for the question, is this man a fascist or not? For what we would call a matter of convenience, and someone else might call opportunism. At that time, it was preferred to let it go, to close the files containing the disgraceful and hard-to-digest accusations regarding the fascist past, and to give the chance to start over. This happens in the ministries, including the Ministry of Justice. This happens in the police forces and in the armed forces. Even at the level of the intelligence services, colonels, generals, admirals, many of them have a fascist past, but they are accepted and reinstated in service. Let's not even talk about police chiefs and prefects. Many of them with a fascist past resume their duties, and some even advance in their careers. This is the case of Police Chief Guida, who would become the police chief of Milan, even though he had run the special prison on the island of Ventotene during fascism. The fact that the future president of the Republic, Sandro Pertini, refused to shake hands with Police Chief Guida, calling him the fascist police chief, is something that, many years later, would awaken old ghosts. Another issue exists which is purely political. The lack of a process of not denazification but defascistization in Italy allowed the emergence of political movements and later parties that explicitly drew on fascism itself. Despite the existence of that famous transitional and final provision of the Italian Constitution, which prohibits the reconstitution in any form of the dissolved fascist party, and despite this provision being regulated through the so-called Selba law, well, post-fascist movements have piled up in the history of the Republic, some maintaining or acquiring an aura of respectability and presentability, others becoming protagonists of periods of violence. I'm referring to Ordine Nuovo, Avanguardia Nazionale, Terza Posizione, all organizations that sooner or later end up under the scrutiny of the judiciary and are dissolved by the authorities. This shows how the lack of a phase of deep analysis in Italian society, even through the administration, becomes evident. The actions have determined a certain path that, over the years and decades, has led to constant evolutions in our politics. What has been called transitional justice, obviously transition from one political phase to another, from one political history to another, has not really established a true reconciliation. If anything, it has given a second, a third, a fourth chance. If anything, it has provoked indignation. The Italian state benefited from it from an internal point of view, and by internal I mean within its own structures, avoiding having to start from scratch in the prefectures, in the police headquarters, in the police forces, less so in the Carabinieri Corps, certainly in the armed forces and in many, many ministries, as well as in the courts. But this did not allow the Republic, which was born fragile and needed attention and care, to uproot the fascist seed, to prevent the repetition of what had happened. Many experienced the administration of the acts as a sort of pact of silence. I don't report. In exchange, you who could be reported understand how to act and avoid causing me trouble or harm. You work for the community. But this pact of silence is a sort of mutilation of justice. And this is the real background of the Togliatti Amnesty, which probably also had some just principles within it. The desire to give a second chance, the desire to start over, to guarantee it to a country that absolutely needed to begin again. Unfortunately, though, the intentions remained on paper, at least the good intentions. The fact that murderers, rapists, torturers were set free and were able to live their lives without any problems, not answering for what they had done. All of this was experienced as a deep injustice by various social classes. The fact that the amnesty only showed one side of itself, the side of erasure, annulment, reduction of punishment, and not the side of rebuilding the social fabric. It caused inequalities, protests, uprisings in the streets. And so, even today, 80 years later, we still ask ourselves, was there really no other way besides the Togliatti Amnesty? Did Italy, having emerged devastated on so many levels from World War II, really have no other choices? Was it really not possible to follow the example used by the Allies in Germany? Even though the conditions in Germany and Italy were different, and even though Germany at that time was not really a country, but rather under full and complete foreign occupation by several powers, while Italy was beginning to regain the appearance of an autonomous nation. Did really no one feel the need to reconsider the past, to remove the diseased cells from our organism, an organism that is complex? And I'm talking about the Italian state. Was there really nothing else that could have been done? I leave these final questions to you, and if you want, feel free to answer in the comments.